Good evening, everyone. What a fantastic turnout we've had tonight. I see some people keeping their hands up to block out that sun. Who ever thought that we would need even to think about that when we left Lewis this morning? But are there any empty seats on this side, Meg, if anybody really is being blinded? So this is an opportunity, if you are literally being blinded. Perfect. Okay, that's the last thing I'm going to say about that. Okay, it's up to me to give our official welcome tonight. I'm Agnes Rennie, I'm Vice Chair of Community Land Scotland and Chair of Urasaura Gauze. That's Golson Estate Trust. And it's this event is now in its third year. An event, and let me just make sure that I don't forget any of the things that I've been asked to say. You know the way these things are, I'll wander off a bit. An event that started in 2024 to coincide with what Community Land Scotland badged as the year of community land ownership, and that was to coincide with, in fact, the longest standing community owned trust, which is Torre in Lewis. There was a bit of a gap after that, it has to be said, but 1993 onwards it all kicked off again, and that I think is where we begin to think about the modern community land owning world that we all know and see developing day by day. So who was Simon Fraser? Many of you in this room will have known Simon. I certainly knew him personally. I knew him in school, I knew him at university, and then I knew him as our factor, which is not the word we most often associate with Simon. In fact, when he and I were students in Aberdeen, we performed a play. Do you remember that, Anne? The Host, which was a play by Ian Crichton Smith, where he brought back to life the clearances of Sutherland. And Simon played the role of the judge, and I was the old lady who was tossed out of her house. And so back then, we were starting to think about things like the injustices and the need for justice. So it was no surprise at all that as Simon went on to become a lawyer in the islands, that he became very involved in this process. And when the challenge of trying to find an answer to what was happening in Assynt was set before him, he was very much the brains from the legal side that ploughed a way through that, which I think it's fair to say led us to the network we have today. And that network, soon after Assynt, and with the support of people like Brian Wilson and others at the political level, led to the setting up of the Community Land Unit, led to the legislation which has moved on several iterations since then, and many other things that now we largely take for granted, although we still continue to fight and campaign and advocate for more. Simon sadly passed away some years ago, but not before he was able to see Egg, Gia, Golson, North Harris, Uist, and many other communities going forward and taking ownership of their own land. And this series of lectures, which right from the start was sponsored by Anderson MacArthur, the solicitors' company in Stornoway that Simon was a partner in, who sponsored these lectures, this year supported by Harper MacLeod, which we're very pleased that both these organisations have supported this event tonight. And so, from now on, it'll be every second year. But last year, this year and in 24, we've had a series of events, and tonight's event is the 2026 event. And we really do hope that you're going to enjoy and find tonight's discussions stimulating and entertaining, who knows. And it's my pleasure to start off the evening by remembering Simon, and helping me to do that, right beside me, is Anne Fraser, who actually absolutely knew far more about what Simon did in those days than any of the rest of us. And to my left, Maggie Mackay, who I think it's fair to say was Simon's protege, and to this day works with community land trusts and crofting in her own role in Anderson MacArthur. And to my right, far right, John Watt, who was the first director of the Community Land Unit and spent many, many years working with HIE, and most recently, and until tomorrow, a member of the board of Community Land Scotland. So, first of all, Anne, turning to yourself, what was it like being with Simon in these early days when he was wrestling, maybe even in his sleep, with trying to find a way? Oh, thank you.
Hello, thank you very much, Community Land Scotland, for inviting me here to this event. I'm really privileged, I feel privileged and humbled to be here. Well, when I think back to these days, I wasn't quite aware at the extent, of Simon's work. I just remember days and evenings of him sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop and all these papers around him. And I remember me, in the kitchen, obviously, maybe I'd be peeling potatoes, maybe at the sink, and he'd be explaining, he'd be talking about these things that he was doing, and obviously at the very beginning, especially for ascending, and he'd be talking, and after a few minutes, he would just say to me, "Anne, you haven't been listening to a single word I've said." And how I wish that I was listening. But I would say probably now, I can imagine that he would probably have devised a couple of more legal frameworks, obviously to get round difficult situations. And I would imagine that he would have been quite radical. And actually, I'm thinking back to his Aberdeen days, when actually yourself and himself actually were quite radical in getting things done. So
that can't be true.
Yes. So I'd imagine that that's probably how we would be. I think he would probably have been quite keen, quite enough to be obviously getting involved in more of the community buyouts in whichever shape or form. Agnes.
So, thinking back, and just quickly, can you remember his excitement when Ascent was finally through?
Oh yes, definitely. I think he was actually in Edinburgh, when the whole deal was sealed, and it was absolutely mind-blowing. Really, it was. Obviously, they had a big celebration in Edinburgh, and it made headlines in the news. And I would say, I feel that you remember this, the picture of the late Alan McRae up on the hill in Ascent, with his hand up saying, "We won the land." I think it's something that we'll never forget. So these are kind of things that I remember about the past days. Mm-hmm.
Brilliant. I think it's wonderful to remember these high points, because for all the hours that he undoubtedly spent ploughing through legalese, there was a reward. John, the land unit that you then were invited to set up and were very much party to, you were very involved in that. What are your memories from that time?
Yes, I remember it was 1997 when Brian Wilson, who we've mentioned before, essentially instructed Highlands and Islands Enterprise to set up a land unit to help other communities. He did this, he launched this in the island of Egg when they acquired their land, and he said communities shouldn't struggle to get this, they should get help to do this. Aston had to do it themselves for over many years, Egg had to do it themselves. So he decided that HIE should set up a unit to help communities do that. And I remember our chief executive wasn't entirely sure this was going to be a lasting thing or not. And but he'd been kind of instructed by a minister, so he was with it enough to think I better say yes. So eventually I was appointed, and I'm delighted that I was, and eventually grew a team. And eventually, of course, met Simon Fraser and started working with him and some of the other big community buyouts of that time. And Simon was quite remarkable. He was a totally dedicated professional. He had to deal, as you were saying, with very complex cases. These were big estates, lots of assets, rather ancient titles, disputed boundaries, and they all had to be negotiated. And once the community decided they wanted to buy it, his job was to do the deals legally. I suppose my job was to find the money to pay for it. And we had some successes in doing that. So Simon was, it was easy for me to go and get the money than it was for him to do all this work behind the scenes on these complex legal arrangements. So that's one thing I remember. He was very community minded. He was very active in his own community. He became the independent chair of the Isle of Egg Heritage Trust. He was a very strong advocate of community land ownership as part of the overall land reform debate. He valued the culture of communities in terms of language, the arts and music, as well as just the people working together. So Simon and I had several events where we had to basically present to communities what a community buyout was and how it could be taken forward. And as I say, he was very objective. He never forced communities to buy things. He gave the facts of how to do it and what the benefits could be, what the challenges were. He was never hiding from the challenges. And so in public meetings, he would give these, and I remember that in here and in Harris, sometimes to a sceptical audience. Audiences were not initially always hugely supportive. They wanted to know the facts. He was open to hearing people's different views and listening to questions. And I remember in Gia, several people approached us after the meeting wanting to speak to Simon and myself privately because they didn't want to stand up in a meeting like this and ask questions which people might have found embarrassing or difficult. So it was a bit like Batman and Robin going around the community, knocking on doors, and he said, I remember once when we were knocking on doors to discuss this with people, he said, well, I hope they answer the door, because they might think we're the Mormons. and so there was a lot of humour, there was a lot of adventures. I remember Simon reporting back, negotiating with Cameron McIntosh. Do you remember Cameron McIntosh? The impresario from the West End in London was keen to be involved in the buyout of Knocknagael. And Simon was they had to go to the theatre in Edinburgh, actually, where they were doing a performance, to negotiate with Cameron Mackintosh. And his report was very colourful in terms of the artistic way of negotiating that Cameron Mackintosh had. So I've got many other stories, Agnes. These were some of the ones that struck me, and the impact that Simon had in these early days especially was deeply significant.
Thanks very much, John. I think what that reminds us all of too, and it's something that Simon himself was very aware of. Yes, he was to a large extent the legal brains, but he had people like yourself and others working very closely with him all along the way. And without that, it would have been very difficult to make things happen. Now, I mentioned earlier on that with us also tonight is Maggie Mackay, who was very much a protege of Simon's and continues to work at Anderson MacArthur to this day. Maggie, can you share with us, maybe as that young solicitor starting with Simon and now still working in this sector, what it was like early days and learning at his elbow?
Thank you, Agnes. Good evening, everybody. It was a privilege, obviously, to work with Simon. I knew who Simon Fraser was. He had no idea who I was, of course. I should probably say that my his first indication of who I was through the community land movement. So I was, after I graduated, I was a director of Bwrdd Housing at the time of their buyout. Galston Estate buyout, and it was actually at the buyout party that one of the directors, I wasn't actually there, I was doing my postgraduate diploma in legal practice, and I have told the story before, so apologies for anyone who's heard it before, but he, at the party, Carloway, who's not here this evening so I can name and shame her, who's now the vice chair of Galston, so she's still there, everybody seems to stay everywhere, I think Agnes is also still there. I managed to escape through a conflict of interest technicality. So at the party, Carola obviously spoke to Simon, and I got a phone call from her the next day where she said, I was at the buyout party. I said, how was it? Oh, yes, and lots of chat about how lovely it was. And I spoke to Simon Fraser, and I told him you might want a traineeship. But I don't know if you do, so I have no idea what your plans are. So she must have done a very good job of persuading him that I was worth a shot. So, cut a long story short then, Simon was in Glasgow and we met. And to say it was an interview would be a bit of a push, I would say, to be honest. So I was very fortunate to then start working with him and doing my training with him. You mentioned that he was very very much part of the community, and but he was also very much part of very giving. He would give a lot of time to his community, but he also gave a lot of time to help train people and sharing of information. He wasn't one of these solicitors who would hide behind it's my information, so I'm not sharing it. He was very giving in that way, and certainly on the community side, one of the last community buyouts that he had negotiated was Carloway, and I remember phoning him because I had been doing the legal side of it, and he was just delighted at that stage to have seen it going through. He was unwell by that stage, but he just so much history, so much work had gone in, and there's still very large files, boxes and boxes of files of Simon's work, which from all these buyouts, and just a wealth of knowledge that unfortunately we've lost, but certainly he did his best to pass it on. I'm not saying that I have the knowledge, I certainly do not have the radical, I'm not ready to start a protest quite yet, but he certainly passed on his experience and was very giving of his time to his community, and to me personally it was certainly a privilege to work with him.
Thanks very much, Maggie. I think it's fantastic that, here we are 30 years later and we're still talking about taking a radical approach to this journey that we're all on. And I think it's, tonight is part of that radical journey, and without people looking to find different ways of doing things, we wouldn't be where we are. And okay, like every other sector, some groups have more problems than others. We all have problems. Anybody who says otherwise, I never believe that, because life just is not like that. So, please join me in thanking our 3 guests tonight. And it's my pleasure now to hand over to MacInnes, our chair at Community Land Scotland, who will introduce our panel. And while we get off the stage, they'll then get on, and you're then into phase 2. Hang on to your glasses.
Very much, Agnes, and thanks to Anne and Maggie and John, and good evening, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. I can't think of a better way to start this year's Memorial Lecture for Simon Fraser than to hear the very personal stories from Anne and from others who worked with him about the insights of just how important his work was, but also, you know, the humour and the adventures, and that what really gave it that radical edge at the time, and the legacy that we continue to see today and to work with. Although I never had the pleasure of meeting Simon, the impact of what he achieved can be felt every day throughout the community land movement, and is very much the foundation stone of what the work that Community Land Scotland continues to do. So I'm delighted to be able to chair this event tonight. We are going to build on that foundation and look forward to the next 5 years in terms of what are the big issues, the challenges and the opportunities facing all of us within the community land movement. Simon and others laid that key legal and governance foundation that we all build on. And since then, we within the community land movement continue to build on the work of Assynt, Egg, Knocknagael, Golson, Gia, North Harris, Carloway, so many other community-owned projects across the length and breadth of Scotland who are now part of that radical journey. And when we think about this movement and how we can together respond to these issues, the challenges and the opportunities, then a key part of that is being able to draw on that lived experience and knowledge of those who are just slightly ahead of us in that journey, and use it to do better at what we're doing, and then pass it on to those who are slightly behind us, and together move forward to be able to jointly achieve what we all want to be achieved. So I'm really delighted to be able to continue that conversation and continue that learning journey together with 3 really fantastic people from amazing community land ownership groups. We've got Dr. Maria de la Torre from Knocknagael in Inverness, Isla Kinnear from Fintry Development Trust, and Michael Hunter from North Harris Trust and Carloway Estate Trust. So each of them is going to speak for about 5 minutes, just giving us an overview of what their community group is up to and some of the fantastic successes and also some of the challenges they've experienced so far. We're then going to have a brief panel discussion between the 4 of us before we open out into question and answers with all of you. Please be aware that the event's being recorded and will be available online later. And then we're going to be finishing that part of the event around 8 o'clock. And after that, we're going to be hearing from the renowned Gaelic singer Anne Martin. And then we're going to be closing and wrapping up by 8:30. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Maria, who's the chair of the Knocknagael Limited Group, a charity based in Inverness, who very recently acquired the Smiddy Field, which was part of the Scottish Government's bull stud farm. Maria was heavily involved in the formation of the charity and the work that's led up to that community asset transfer. And aside from that, she has extensive experience working with communities within the public sector, Nature Scotland particularly, and also has been a serving member for a very long time of your local community council. And she's also a keen grower and manages a local woodland within Inverness. So, over to you, Maria.
I'd like to thank Community Land Scotland for organising this event in Inverness and inviting us to be part of it. We've just acquired a field of over 8 hectares, which was part of the Scottish Government boosted farm at the edge of Inverness, and our plans are to create allotments, over 145 in the first phase, an orchard and a community growing area. I'm just going to say a little bit about our story and then 3 key reflections. It has taken us a decade. Our story started in 2013 when the Smiddy and adjacent fields were declared surplus to the requirements of the boosted farm and were put up for planning permission. That sparked a campaign to save the fields, and the idea of using this good agricultural land for allotments gathered momentum. An association was formed in 2016 with the initial idea to rent some of the land. In 2020, we were encouraged by Hannah's Alliance Enterprise to form Knocknagael Limited and put in an asset transfer request for purchasing a field. This was refused because the field was required for the farm. Ironically, at the same time, the field was being promoted as a housing site by Scottish Government. We appealed and had to go through a review process led by the Planning and Environmental Appeal Division, with an independent panel headed by a reporter and a formal 2-day hearing conducted in Inverness. Thankfully, the panel recommended our transfership progressive conditions, primarily related to acquiring planning permission and a clawback clause allowing Scottish Government to recoup the money if the field was to be sold for non-agricultural use. Also, thankfully, the recommendation was accepted by the Minister, and we received a formal notice in late 2023 that the asset transfer could go ahead. We applied for a third time to the Scottish Land Fund and ended the cut between Scottish Government and Scottish Land Fund requirements, with the former wanting a 25-year clawback clause that was not accepted by Scottish Land Fund as it was not considered to follow good practice. In the end, after considerable correspondence, an exception was accepted by the Scottish Land Fund and we were offered a grant. It has still taken us over 2 years to negotiate the land transfer, with the goalposts continually changing. Requests to keep 3 metre strip, fencing, then changes of mind, even at the very last minute, new conditions kept appearing. We bit at it, and with the support of our solicitor, eventually managed to acquire the land this January, 10 years later. What are the 3 key points from our experience? First of all, the legislation is not perfect but provides a framework. The Community Empowerment Act allows organisations to make requests for public assets, and we are privileged to have this framework. The benefits of our request should have been obvious, but there are significant flaws in the process. We found ourselves dealing with hostile officials that kept on putting obstacles in the way. Unless the public body has set up an independent process, there is a conflict of interest between those managing the asset and making the decision. We also found that continually the timelines in the legislation were being ignored. What could have been done 2 years too late. Given that Scottish Government Agriculture Department owned the land, a reasonable person would have hoped that they would have been trying to lead by example. The process shouldn't be this hard and needs to be improved, and this is a message for politics and just to reflect on. Our second message is more about support community groups, and I think it's the message that there is support and help out there. It is hard work, but with persistence and time, you can do it. Our project had strong public support from the start, from the communities and our organisation, and we were able to benefit from the expertise of our directors. This came to the fore at the hearing. The Scottish Government solicitors were not able to answer questions, but we had a room full of witnesses that showed we have the community behind us. We had external help from our organisations like Dita's Community Land Scotland, Highlands Alliance Enterprise and the Scottish Land Fund. Without that initial word of get on with it, we wouldn't have started. One needs to learn how things work, but there is significant help available there. And finally, my key message is that community ownership matters. It's not about dumping assets, but giving assets of value to the community, like good agricultural land. It's a whole different ball game to own an asset, which is why continuing the journey that pioneers like Simon Fraser started matters. It has already had an impact, and having ownership will change how the community feel and are able to influence the future of the Smiddy Field. It is particularly important in urban areas where access to land is more difficult. Having the opportunity to grow your own food and connect with land is even more important. Considering how much Inverness is changed, it was a one-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We have only owned the land for 3 months, so it is still all very new, but we have plans for receiving the field. In fact, just this evening, some planning has started, and we have plans to have our first volunteer days at the field next week. I would like to end up by thanking the rest of the directors, as this has been a team endeavour.
Thanks, Maria, and congratulations. 3 months into one of the newest community-owned ownership projects, it is just very frustrating that it took a decade, and what should have been a straightforward process in terms of an asset transfer was just so complicated and involves so many hurdles. But it's really good to hear that you're now having reached that milestone and can look forward in terms of what you want to do with the site. We're now going to turn to Isla, who is the director of Fintry Development Trust in Stirling, has been a director, of Fintry Development Trust in Stirling since 2023, and this was the first community group in the UK to enter into a co-ownership agreement with a private wind farm development. Isla has a strong interest separately in how communities interact with and benefit from energy developments, and is in the process of completing her PhD thesis on this at the University of Glasgow. So over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So the story for Fintry started around 2003 when the developers Falk turned up to a community council meeting and they were offering the usual sort of community wealth fund. But there was 4 people in the meeting who we now call the Fintry 4, and they thought that they could get a better deal for the community. They ultimately wanted there to be a wind turbine that was directly supplying the community, because we're not on the main gas grid, we're solely relying on electricity and storage heaters, and there's a real mix of housing stock in Fintry, so it was really inefficient and expensive for a lot of us. Because of the perks of the energy grid, that wasn't possible. But in 2006 we signed a deal where we added a 15th turbine into the development. So we own a 15 share overall, but there is one, and we know which one is the extra one, and we affectionately call that our turbine. We went and took a trip up to the wind farm when it was built, and we all signed the wind turbine with our names on it, and it was all very lovely. And then Falk found out and we're not happy and paid over it. But yes, as pointed out, we were the first community in the UK to do this, and it's been replicated, and we've had a lot of people visit from all over the world to come and see what we've done. And the way that it was achieved was that we had a loan from the developers. So Falk loaned us the money to buy the share with interest, so we paid back over the past 18 years, I think. We just paid off the other year. So it was a sort of win-win for them, that they could get the headlines, the good news that they've gone into partnership with the community, but they also got interesting things as well. So good for everyone involved, I would say. And so what have we done with it? We had our first project back in 2006, which was free cavity wall insulation and thermal heat mapping for any houses that wanted it in Fintry. We have partnered with the Sports Centre, which is the real hub of the community, and we installed a biomass heating system there. They also have the solar array as well. We installed solar panels on the primary school, so there was a solar fund for the children at the primary school and the nursery, so they can do any environmental projects they would like. We have energy efficiency grants for houses, fuel grants, garden grants, business grants, so the money is always being distributed to the community, which is great. But lessons that we've learned, things that we probably shouldn't have done, was in 2015 we installed a district heating network for some hard-to-treat homes in the caravan site nearby, so it was mainly chalets and things like that. That was poorly installed, and the contract meant the installers could kind of get out of it and they washed their hands of it, which meant that it had to be heavily subsidised by us. We hadn't paid off our loan from the wind farm yet, so that was taking a lot of our money from the trust. We've hired an energy consultant for that, and it's got a lot more efficient now. Obviously it put a strain on the community, being a small trust like us, being directly responsible for the energy and hot water of people in the village. But thankfully things are a lot better now, it's in a really strong situation, but yeah, definitely lessons to be learned there of being directly involved. And then in 2018 we had a district heating network that we tried to do for ground source heating, and that was scrapped on day one when they were digging the boreholes and fractured some rock, and put an end to that. So because of this, we sort of pivoted towards enabling rather than being directly involved, and so that's how we're doing the grants, the energy efficiency grants that I mentioned earlier. And that has been working really well. We're getting really good uptake in the community, but we're finding that people will take the grants, but they don't necessarily engage with the trust. So that's a problem that we're trying to overcome just now. And then what's next for us? As I said, we paid off our mortgage in 2023. This coincided with the energy price hikes as well, so we ended up getting significantly more money into our trust than we had anticipated. But then this also meant that we were using the money to then subsidise fuel bills for members of the community, particularly when fuel payments were stopped by government and things. So that has been something to consider. We hired more staff to manage these grants as well. And our repowering negotiations are ongoing with Nadara, who are now owning the wind farm. We don't know what the plan is yet. They are looking to definitely repower, but the wind farm is coming to its end of life. We had a turbine go on fire recently, which thankfully for us, since we owned the share, not one specific turbine, so we just distributed the cost of that amongst ourselves. So yes, repowering is definitely something we want to be involved with. And we are just in ongoing communications with Nadara for that. And we are looking for different ways to invest our income as well. We're finding it quite difficult to find ethical ways to invest our money as well. But yeah, we're just celebrating our 20th anniversary this year, which is great for all of us, and we're going to throw a big party for that in the village. So yeah, that's us.
Thanks, Isla. It's really interesting when someone is, open and reflective of the right decisions and the good decisions were made, but also sometimes when the wrong decisions that were made, and with what you would have done differently with hindsight. I might come back to you on some of those later on. It's also really interesting to hear about that transition from trying to deliver district heating networks yourself to moving towards grants which will enable householders themselves to look at their own energy efficiency as well, in terms of lessons for what other community groups might want to do.
Yep.
Great. All right, then Michael, we're going to hear from you next. So Michael has been a manager of North House Trust since 2020, and before that was the ranger on that estate. And you bring with you a wealth of experience managing this very large community-owned estate, from crofting land management, deer management, managing visitor facilities, and now thinking about affordable housing as well. And you've also additionally just started with the Carloway Estate Trust and are currently the chair of Community Land Outer Hebrides, so I'm sure you're going to have lots of really interesting things to talk about. Over to you.
Thanks Megan, and good evening everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. As Megan said, I'm the manager of the North House Trust. I'm manager at Carloway and chair of Community Land Outer Hebrides, which is sort of parallel sister organisations to Community Land Scotland, and sort of shares 100% membership in between the two, just with a geographical focus in the Western Isles, for those of you who might not have heard about us. I've been asked to say something about the future of large-scale estate management and community ownership, especially in relation to ecological regeneration and land management planning. I'm not sure I have the expertise to say too much on that, but I can certainly share a little bit about my experience, particularly in North Harris, which is sort of the majority of my professional experience. Probably it's relevant to just share a little bit about the context into which I came. So the North Harris buyout began in 2003, which Simon delivered for the people of North Harris. It was subsequently expanded with the addition of the Seaforth estate in 2008 and the island of Scalpay in 2013. So that's quite a large estate now, 26,000 hectares, and it's one of the largest in the country, and the sort of reunification of that historic estate and geographical community. So the direction for North Harris is possibly quite different to other places in some ways, in that only half the land was under crofting tenure. And so there's a large deer forest, about 12,000 hectares, as part of the first buyout. And that meant that, as well as being the landowner, we were also the occupier in agricultural terms, allowing us to access grants, agricultural grants, and think a little bit more about land usage. That area is also highly designated, so SSI, SAC, Special Area of Conservation, SPA, Special Protected Area. So that had a bias towards land management and conservation in terms of what the organisation was about, as it were. Access was also thought to be very important, so community access, public access, maintaining paths and tracks. Deer management goes along with that in terms of our responsibilities. I suppose that's a big part of what I'd like to bring to the fore, is that becoming a landowner, even a community landowner, means you take that responsibility for yourself, take that responsibility as a community. And so it becomes your responsibility to manage that asset, but manage that responsibility that you hold together. So, in my own time, since 2019, I moved to Harris to take up the post of ranger, and that gave me a really sort of hands-on approach to what the estate was about. In 2020, my predecessor moved on, and I moved up to the manager position. And you know, I suppose I've really loved my job and that opportunity, and that has been gifted to me by the people of Harris, I suppose, ultimately the people of North Harris, and that board of directors who have in place sort of a trust in me to say, right, let's go, let's develop this thing. So there has been a number of land management projects, I suppose, I'd like to raise. So deer management has really changed, and so as well as just coming into role, there was a 20-year arrangement with a private estate. So as well as the buyout in 2003, a private estate also bought part of the fishing rights. It's all a little bit complicated, but effectively that meant that there was a 20-year lease with that private estate for deer management, which expired pretty recently. And that meant that we were able to sort of completely revise how we're doing the deer, and completely changed how we approach it. And we have a community stocking group, and we stock ourselves, so I stock on behalf of the trust as well. And that's, we've written a new deer management plan, and that's just completely changed how the population is managed. So that's been a real success, and that win-win that I think has been mentioned here before, in terms of benefits for private business, benefits for the community, and benefits for also the trust itself. So, also, we've undertaken a nature restoration project. So tree planting, I suppose, is the way to think about that. So we've undertaken an agreement with common grazings, with crofters, to plant over 1,000 hectares, to not plant out 1,000 hectares, but in pockets, plant up sort of specific areas that we feel would benefit from a little bit more of native woodland. So that's been a really interesting project to take part in as well. And then beyond that, taking a slight step back beyond the sort of key projects that you might identify and focus on, there's the management of the estate as a business, and you know, we need to have an income to be able to fund our core activity, and that comes from the estate itself. So that comes from our deer management that comes from leases that we hold, that we issue on various assets. And so that allows us to run the estate, and there's really very little funding now coming in to run our business. And I think that's a really important point that I'd like to sort of bring to the fore in this in terms of how we go forward. Is I think Maria mentioned, assets being dumped on the communities. If it's something that doesn't generate an income, I don't know why the community should step forward and be forced to take it on. Communities need to be given something that can work financially and allow them to develop the asset the way they see fit. So we're fortunate in North Harris. I'm only new in Carloway, but I'm hoping that we're going to be fortunate there as well, that we can develop these assets to make them work for everyone. So yeah, happy to hand back to you again.
Thanks, Michael. That was great. It's really interesting to hear from an estate which is just so big and has to behave like a very large scale estate management body in other places in terms of having to deal with SSIs and deer management and all of these other elements of the story when it comes to land management that smaller community ownership groups don't need to think about. So that's really interesting. It's also been fascinating hearing from the three of you about the range of experiences, in terms of very successful estate management, estates which are struggling to find places to invest your funds because you're generating so much income, in comparison to very new community ownership groups which have had an incredibly challenging decade, simply even getting to the point where you have the piece of paper that says that you own that land. And I think it's also really interesting, again, also to reflect on the difference of scale between the three of you, between 8 hectares and tens of thousands of hectares that you're responsible for. And this question of the quality of the asset as well. It's interesting that you both brought up this question of the fact that dumping unviable assets on community groups is not the way that community ownership should be moving forward, and the importance of community groups themselves doing their own research and due diligence to check that any asset that they are considering buying is actually of quality and is something that you can viably run a business and generate income from in terms of that long-term sustainability for the project. I wanted first to come back to you, Michael and Isla, just in terms of both of you talked about working in partnership. Isla, obviously Fintry Development Trust has had this long-term partnership with a private company. You've recently had a change of ownership of that partner. And Michael, you talked about working with with a private company in terms of the fisheries rights and things. Can you give your top tip of how community ownership groups what they need to think about if they're considering these kind of partnerships?
Yeah, so we have to recognise that there is a private sector, I suppose, in the first place, and engage proactively. So the buyout in North Harris probably, we don't know, crystal ball, but probably wouldn't have happened if there hadn't been that engagement with the private estate. So the private buyer bought the fishing rights and a castle, the estate lodge, effectively, allowing the community to be able to afford to buy the land. Otherwise, I think that roughly cut the price in half of that first estate purchase. So that has to be recognised. There's private interest in using land and using assets, and so whatever form that takes, we need to engage with it and promote what we have, promote what we own, and use the marketplace to gain that income that we need, which we then, in the sort of traditional community land trust model, as charitable companies, invest it in our charitable purposes. And the community is making those decisions on how it's invested, on where we need to develop. And it obviously becomes a little bit of a grey area in the middle, perhaps, where we might develop projects which have a little bit of a sort of private interest. And I suppose it's a continuum, really. But that's what I think about the private sector. Crucial. It's what we live in, I suppose. Thank you.
Thanks. Isla.
I suppose I would say that having external support is very interesting. Like Maria was saying, that having people like Community Land Scotland, Scottish Land and Fintry going up against the Scottish Government is really important. And so for us, having our MP to help negotiate with us back when we were trying to go up against the private developers and tenants, that's really, really important. And having enthusiastic members of the board and of the community as well, and showing a united front to be like, this is what is best for us, and we're not going to sort of break against the private developers, and just being persistent as well. And we had to stick at it and believe, what we wanted. So
that's really important. I think that's in a way what I wanted to do. Part of this discussion was to reflect a bit on Simon Fraser's own view of this in terms of a famous quote that he gave on the day of the buyout of Egg, which he described as a triumph for all that is good in humanity, and certainly one in the eye for everything that is mean-spirited and self-seeking. And I think that that's a good description of the sort of, whilst it's important for community groups to think about partnerships with a range of different stakeholders, there is something existentially different about community-owned assets and community-owned land in terms of what you can do with that and what that means now, and also what it means for the community in the long term, in the future. So Maria, for your community, you've had 10 years of trying to get there, you're now there. What is going to make the difference for your community in terms of now being able to own the land and be in control of it?
Mm-hmm. So a few thoughts on that. I mean, first of all, we are changing from being a campaign group to becoming a group that is managing an asset. So it's a step change that we're gradually starting to do, thinking about how we've set up a donation model. But for us, I think the next challenge is developing the infrastructure. We've already got plans of that. We've hit the ground running because we've got planning permission and landscape designs, but we're conscious that we'll need to develop the infrastructure over the next 2 years, and keeping our supporters on board and making sure that people understand that process is important. You can only start that process once you own land, because raising funding is not possible till then. But what we are confident is that once we start, people will start joining count and help and get more involved. I think the most exciting bit is going to see things happening. For example, we're just about to start planting the field. Even just that happening and the opportunities for people to get involved with volunteering in the fields and planting, that's going to bring people together. So I think, while there's still a way to go, there is, even just the small steps that we're taking will have an impact. Just thinking about what we will bring in the others about partnerships, the potential as well of this project in terms of developing partnerships with other organisations that want to use the land. In our case, we have a number of charities that see it as beneficial, and we've got quite a lot of local schools. So there is quite a range, and I think that's what's perhaps different of our community-owned asset, that you are going to look at working a lot more closely with others than you would in other circumstances.
Great, thank you very much. We were tasked on this panel to not just discuss where we are and where we've been, but also what's coming up in the next 5 years. So I want to ask each of you, where do you think you'll be in 5 years, and what one change in the external environment, whether it's legislative or policy or other things, would help you get there? Isla, would you like to start?
An exciting stage for Fintry the next 5 years. So let's say because we paid off the loan, it is sort of where do we go with the investment? I think, I'm not sure really. I think it's sort of a case of the curse of too much money. Can I say that? In the community of it. We're sort of just seeing where that takes the community. I'm not sure. What do you think on that? Yeah.
curse of too much income, yes. Maria, you've spoken a bit about the immediate plans, but where do you imagine the project will be in 5 years?
I mean, I think by then we will have the allotment set up and running, so that will be quite exciting to see that happening and people being able, in particular, that sense of having people the opportunity to grow food and connect with the land. I mean, I think it will be amazing because we know there's a lot of people that have been desperate for that to happen for a long time. One of the next phases we're planning on is to start developing a community growing agriculture supported group project. So that's by then, once we've got the allotments up and running, we'll be able to think about those next stages. And we should have as well an orchard. We've got grafted trees. So hopefully by then we'll be able to collect some fruit. So quite a lot of things that we'll be able to see on the ground by then, we would hope.
Great, thank you. Michael, obviously you've got three different hats that we're on the stage today. I'd be interested to know, sort of, both in terms of North Harris, this large estate with substantial environmental commitments and lots of well-established business plans. But I'm also wondering from Community Land Outer Hebrides, where the sort of sector as a whole sees it hopes to get to within the next 5 years.
Thanks, yeah. So on North Harris, I suppose it's still being there in 5 years, and probably that's the same for all the community estates. I think every year that we're still in ownership of our land and able to have a say in it is a win, and we have to grow just to stay there, just to stay where we are, as we all know. In terms of Community Land Outer Hebrides, there's obviously, well, not obviously, we may know that there's a buyout on the cards in Harris, so that would be an excellent step, given that it's been quite a few years now since there has been a large buyout in the Western Isles. That would be amazing and would keep a little bit of momentum, which seems to have perhaps been lost recently. Beyond that, in terms of the organisation, in terms of CLO as an organisation, it would be nice to see a bit more, I suppose, the environmental side of things. We think there's an opportunity there in terms of funding. We think there's an opportunity there in terms of linking up at a larger, so I know we think an estate is quite a large place. However, there's also the perspective of the Western Isles as a whole, the regional perspective in terms of benefits for nature and benefits for the people that live there. And so we think there's an opportunity there in terms of growth, and it would be nice to see that partially realised in 5 years' time. And that's a very long-term vision, I think, in terms of decades as well. Yeah.
Sorry, just to ask a follow-up question. What would that involve then, in terms of the change of being able to work together around nature and environmental objectives?
Unfortunately, what's coming to mind is that it involves killing things. Invasive non-native species is a big problem, especially in islands. So that's something that we've been quite successful with. Especially plant species. There's other funded work, so Nature Scott are quite involved in this area, obviously. So that would be a very important part of it, probably, in terms of just managing our ecosystems. And that has an economic impact on our crofters and a wider economic impact. Also, our native species, in terms of promoting those. So, deer management, sorry to mention it again, and native woodland, peatland, those networks go beyond any individual estate, and those connections go beyond. So we do think there's an opportunity there, and that's the level at which it operates beyond just an individual community landholder.
Great. Well, that's definitely one to watch. Maybe get you back here in the next time the Memorial Lecture is in Inverness and hear how it's all going. Right. Well, we're now going to move on to open the floor to all of you for questions, comments, or anything you would like to ask the panellists. Are you coming up, Rachel? Are you coming up to get the mic? Okay. So, if you can. Please give your name and sort of what affiliation you might want to be, what hat you might want to be wearing this evening when you speak. That would be really helpful. Thank you.
Thanks. I don't know what my affiliation is anymore. Ariane Burgess. I'm a candidate for Applecross Region Parliamentary Election and I am the Green Party spokesperson for Land Reform. Thanks so much for this evening and the conversation. There's so much in it. A couple of things that have popped up. There's been many things that have popped up, but one is a question that would work for all of you, is around, in the last 5 years of my work on land reform, what are the inputs from the government, particularly, but also public bodies, was a kind of second-class citizenship of communities, like communities somehow don't know what they're doing, and I hear you all talking really brilliantly about what you're doing. I've spoken with other community organisations where they feel like they're trying to get things from Transport Scotland or whoever, Nature Scholar, whoever. And actually, a recent example of the Fintry Development Trust that set up an energy company in the Carloway Peninsula, and they wanted to take on the repowering of the Forest Land Scotland wind turbines that were on their land. They were overlooked because they were community. Now that's been rectified, but I do think that there's a kind of cultural thing in government, in public bodies, that somehow see communities as second class or somehow don't know what they're doing. And I would like to hear from you, how can we help that shift? We really need that cultural shift. And then the other one, just to throw towards Fintry, is, and I think there's restrictions for you, but you are abundant in income, but is there something we could do in legislation or regulations or that would allow you to share that abundance with communities that don't have it? So some kind of twinning process where you could choose to twin with another community that could take some of your wealth off their hands.
Thanks, Ariane. Isla, I'm going to start with you then, if you maybe touch on both of those, and then we'll have go to Maria and Michael.
Yeah, thank you. I honestly had that thought when we were discussing that it would be great, because it's something that we were thinking about even within the community just last week, about if we were to have grants that right now it's £1,000 for energy efficiency, but that's only if the homeowner is able to pay for the first certain amount of the grant, and so that's leaving out a certain amount of people within the community. So we were thinking about doing just loans straight to people in the community. So yes, to giving money to other trusts, it would be great, but it's a certain amount of risk involved in that, and if there is a way for there to be infrastructure policy put in place that we wouldn't lose our money, communities wouldn't lose money if they were to lend to people within their community or other trusts that need it, that would be great, and we would love to, because that's exactly what we're looking for: ethical investments, environmental sustainable investments. That would be great. And so for communities that there is a belief that we don't know what we're doing, as I said earlier, sort of banding together with these organisations that are really important, and also just forming alliances with other trusts that are similar. Like Fintry going out on their own back in 2003 was a lot of people we had to get involved, and a lot of people that didn't want to loan us money either. It was ended up being the developers themselves. Banks didn't want to, because it was the belief that communities too risky, didn't know what they're doing. So I would say banding together is very important.
So, that's a very pertinent point, I think, for us, and it came to the fore really at the end when we already had the grant, and even till the last minute, conditions kept appearing, which showed, a lack of respect. Really, I think that was quite clear that if it had been a different party doing the legal transaction, we wouldn't have been treated that way. So, I think there are probably things that could be improved in the process. Perhaps controlling how the conditions that can be imposed, and ensuring there is some accountability. But some part of it could be about training as well, providing better guidance and awareness. But certainly, I think tightening what can be done with the conditions would help.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. So second-class citizen or don't know what they're doing narrative. I'm not sure where it comes from. It could be that there's a sort of threatened type of perspective from sort of some parts. I think we do need to be competing on a level playing field, though. So part of that is perhaps that community groups are, there's a recognition that community groups are receiving public funding, and that's necessary in some cases, but that's perhaps perceived as a sort of unfair subsidy by some private groups. And then going back to the thought about receiving assets that aren't necessarily workable. So going back to our North Harris example, where I was saying earlier on that it was a good thing that we didn't have the fishings and didn't have the estate lodge so that we could afford the buyout. Another way to look at it is that the estate was stripped of the most valuable assets and then given to people. So we really need to focus down on what the community are actually getting when they're taking ownership and taking that responsibility. And I think that's crucial, because if that has happened in our case, and we're making it work quite well, I do say to myself, but we're making it work, that's probably happened many times. And so those examples where they've been given not a great asset, not a great opportunity, and it's not working well, no wonder it's not working. And it's amazing it's still there in a lot of cases. So, yeah.
Thanks. I mean, I think certainly from Community Land Scotland's perspective, we as a land movement can never do enough in terms of telling the story of the successes, telling the story of the achievements, telling the story of the challenges and what needs to change. And I think that's something that certainly the staff of CLS are committed to doing, but I think it's also the responsibility of all of us, of everybody within the sector, to continue to take the opportunities to help educate and change that culture so that a community being interested in a potential asset, whether it's an asset transfer or a community right to buy route or a negotiated transfer, that's seen as something positive and something where the benefits are going to be highlighted and the wealth will be retained within the community. And all of the benefits that we see from other community groups can be happening for that particular community as well. And and I think the other thing that really struck me from what you were just saying, Michael, was the importance of, yes, communities being very business-like in terms of the business planning they do prior to acquisition, to make sure that what they're actually focusing on acquiring is really going to be a viable asset in the long run and for the generations in the future. So, Rachel, we need some more questions. Or maybe take 2 or 3 different questions from the floor at this stage, and then we'll hand them over to the panel.
Thanks very much. I'm Ryan, affiliation of the Hungry Pensioners about although I do have a few other hats, I guess. I was certainly very, very privileged to meet Simon on some occasions in the early days. Apologies, this song years back. So it was great. And I was just reflecting partly on Ariane's previous question there about being second-class citizens. I think the challenge is getting hold of professional advice and taking on the public sector under their own terms. That's how I would advise. And certainly in my community, we've actually had to help out the public sector because they didn't know what they were doing. So there are other sides to it. But I think that's what Michael was saying about the environment. Having done the feasibility, being on the team, I was the nature guy on the team for the North Harris C4 buyout, Carloway buyout, Acid and Drumrooney buyout, quite a few of these. And back then, nature was seen as some suspicion, I think, even by some local green fungus across the islands. I'd be interested to know whether you think that at grassroots people are accepting the value of that fantastic environment, whether it's the peatlands or the biodiversity. Because back 25 years ago, as a sort of ecologist, I could see what was coming in terms of biodiversity credits, carbon credits, all these sorts of things that we're talking about today, but it was quite a hard sell back then. So do you think at grassroots level we'll value these things much more than we did in the past, or in different ways, should I say?
Thanks, Duncan. Anyone else have a question at this stage? Maggie, right down at the front here.
Thank you. One of the challenges that you can see with all of the community land trusts is succession in terms of individuals who've been involved. I'm not looking at you, Agnes, for a long time, and being able to attract new blood and people with experience and younger, potentially, different people in, because for sustainability you also need to ensure you've got that succession planning. And just to see if the panel has any suggestions or experience of how that can be done, because I think it's going to be more and more of a challenge. It's already being seen as a challenge.
Great, thank you. That's really important. I mean, any long-term thinking about the long-term needs to think about the people and the processes and how you can bring the young folk in the community into the projects as well. Michael.
Yep, so I'll start off with the designation question and whether community views have changed from that experience. I don't think they have, and I don't know if that's a terrible thing. So although I probably speak the language that I use is things like ecosystems and designations and habitats, I think that's understood differently by most local people, and I think it is valued. And I think the reason that there's able to be what's happened really very recently, that there's able to be designations and able to be talk about the value in nature that is there in the West Isles is because it has been managed well for generations. And so people have managed it well, and they realise the value that is given from the natural environment. It's the basis of our economy. So ultimately. So I think it's just about bridging that language gap and perhaps culture gap. In terms of carbon credits and nature credits, I don't think that's a very good answer for those cultural reasons, and I don't think they're able to capture that value that is seen in the communities that live there. So I don't know whether it's the right way forward. We're all open, obviously, to the possibility. Shall I? Other question? Yeah. So succession, difficult one. I suppose my experience has been that within the board of directors, I'll start off with myself. So as a staff member, I was in post as a ranger for a year and saw how it worked. Okay, it's only 12 months, but that was a really useful way to get a lot of information and just understand how it all works. And much of it is unwritten, not written down anywhere. Probably some of it still isn't written down anywhere. But so that was really important and useful. Also, we've had staff members who have been there for significant amounts of time that have that organisational memory, and that's also crucial. So you do need that retention situation. You need to keep your staff happy and content and engaged in what they're doing. At the board level, which I think is probably more where the question is going, Maggie, similar in that you need that mix. So our experience has been that we've had board members who have been around since the buyout, still. Board members who have been around for 10 years or so, but actually most are recent, within the last 5 years, if not less. So that then gives an opportunity for them to slowly step up, and it takes a long time to learn how it works. So for example, in our constitution we have rotations every 3 years. I'm sure many people are quite similar. That doesn't potentially lend itself very well to this idea of having longevity in those who are really interested and committed, and then a little bit more fluidity to allow that representation and democratic element. It works. It's worked for us, so that's fine. But it does need thought about. I don't know if there's a formal answer. I think it's just an informal thing that we all have to think about. I'm sorry I wasn't able to give a bit more. I have a better one, but there you go.
Thanks, Michael. One of the biggest challenges in terms of board succession planning is bringing young people onto the board. So I don't know, can you talk about what it was about becoming a director at Fintry that attracted you to that role, and are you the only one? Like, what's the demographics? I'm wondering, are you now trying to make sure there's other young folk on the board and involved in the trust?
Yeah, well, I was born and raised in Fintry, so I knew the project from the get-go. Two of the Fintry Forum and one of the managers and everything, they are really close family friends, so I knew what was going on. I was hearing my parents talk about it and things. And then I sort of came into where I am through a roundabout way. I ended up doing economic history at uni, but then I got really interested in energy, and then I started doing my PhD in community participation in energy historically. So then I started that in 2022, and being on the board seemed like a really great fit. I was still living at home at the time, having moved back because of the pandemic, so I wanted to be part of it. And yeah, I joined then, and it was great. It has been great. The demographic of the board, how do I put it politely? I am the only person of my generation on the board. There is a majority in a different generation. Is that demographic? And yeah, I would really like there to be other people from different generations. And I was thinking with the question they asked that a good way for other communities, I think, would be that younger people, if they were from the community but had moved away, they can still be part of the board. Just if you're doing meetings over Zoom and things, I think opening that opportunity up to people to say, you don't have to live in, if it is rural communities and things, you don't have to live there, but you still want to be part of it. Very much if you grow up somewhere, you still do feel part of it. So it'd be nice to have that opportunity. I have since moved away from Fintry. I'm not far, I'm still in Glasgow, but I do all my meetings via Zoom. I'll go to community events and help out where I can. So yeah, still very much part of the board. And for succession planning as well, I think being able to train people up, I think probably getting people in before managers are thinking about retiring, stepping down or whatever, and having them in place for years to come, not just advertising the post when the person steps down is really important. And yeah, also just sort of maybe try to approach younger people within the community to see if they want to be part of it, because sometimes it isn't seen as accessible, that maybe we don't have as much to give, but I think the perspectives of younger people is just important to chime in on any decisions for the community. So yeah.
Thanks, Isla. That's really interesting. Maria, oftentimes I think I have found that boards particularly are challenged retaining community support and retaining community involvement when they're going through a really difficult, long, dragged out process, like unfortunately Knocknagael had to go through. What did you and others do to kind of keep everyone motivated and committed to achieving your goals, even when the goalposts kept on moving forward again?
Yeah, and that has been quite a big challenge, when we started, and we could see, well, this is not going to be a quick process. So one of the things that I think has helped, we've been good at communicating. One of our directors coordinates a newsletter, and I think that's a great way to keep people on board. We always organise social activities and volunteering activities. Even annually we'll do 2 or 3 things, and that gives a sense to people that actually there is a group there and there's things are happening. So I think keeping that information flow is quite key. It's and we are seeing that people respond to that. So that's been quite important.
Great, thank you. We've got time for a couple more questions before we finish this part of the evening. If anyone has a question.
Thank you. My name is Ed Wilson. I've been involved with communities in various ways over too long, I can remember. The question I had was, what level of importance do you guys put to building a structure beneath the volunteer director level? I speak as somebody who's been involved with employee-owned business, which is incredibly simple, actually. Employee-owned businesses have, obviously they run as businesses, but nobody gets wealthy or super rich as an employee business. It runs with a similar purpose to community ownership. But I just wondered, when you run a business, you have a board, of course, and then you have a structure beneath it. You have to make money to pay for that structure. What importance do you guys put, thinking of succession maybe and sustainability of the community asset? What importance do you put to building a structure beneath you? And in Fintry, you might have enough money to make that happen quickly, but other businesses or other communities might have to struggle a little. That's my question.
Great, thank you. And Peter, do you have a question?
Thanks very much. I'm pretending to be Michael Foxley. Michael can't be here tonight because he's at the lambing and it's becoming more difficult than he thought, so he's stuck in the croft. Michael was a great friend of Simon's, and he was also the local councillor for Egg and for Moynihan at the time of the buyout, radical thinker and proponent of land reform all the 40 years that I've known him. His question is, I quote, after the really pathetic crofting of land reform bills recently, and as the estates refuse to share carbon credits and offer little or no community benefit from the renewable schemes, how do we actually radical change? Those who know Michael will know that's exactly it.
Great, I can really see you channeling Michael there, Peter. Thank you. How do we... So we have a question about the governance structure underpinning the board, and then this question of how do we action radical change? Maria.
So I think, this probably depends in terms of the board structure. This depends really on the phase you are at the moment. We are a sort of volunteer-led organisation, and once we move to the phase we've got the asset working, then we will look at changing the structure. But even now, at that stage, we're at sort of developing that volunteer base, which is also quite important to ensure that the organisation pulls in the resources we've got from our members. So there is the two facets to it as we see it. In terms of the radical change, I think it is quite important to, we did a lot of campaigning to try and project the project, and I do think that it's important to keep on sort of fighting for some of these elements to make sure that the system is fair. So I do feel that probably having finally got the asset, we still want to try and encourage others to keep on fighting for making sure that the system works better. So it's good to hear your ideas, Peter. Thank you.
Speaking to building a structure, I suppose we don't really have, we only have 3 paid members of staff. We have 1 manager and then 2 part-time people. And we keep it small and as efficient as possible. We are only a community of 700 people, so trying to employ people from within the community and making sure there's living wage employment and things like that. Just keeping it efficient, I suppose, would be what we'll do. And then I can't really speak to the other ones much. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks. Yeah, so on structure below board level, so most of you, many of you will probably already know, so there's a company secretary below the board, and So that's myself. Usually there's a sort of manager / company secretary, and then there's a staff structure below that in, I think, most traditional, let's call it, community land trust models. That seems to work in most cases. So there's a level of responsibility obviously taken by that company secretary individual. The workload in terms of running an estate is just unsustainable for a volunteer board. Obviously you've got amazing individuals who have done a lot to drive community land trusts forward, but in terms of the long term, in terms of volunteer burnout and sustainability, it just isn't possible, I don't think. And so in terms of community land under Hebrides, for example, so that's the prime focus at the moment. So as a board member there as part of that organisation, we have one and a bit staff member at the minute, and that's the main focus is, how do we sustain that staffing, because without it, the amount we're going to be able to achieve is just so very limited. And it would just effectively, without staff, it would just go into like hibernation, effectively. So that would be my view on that. On radical change, I think what we're already doing is radical, especially in a historical context. And I think we should be championing that, and recognising and appreciating what we already have. I suppose I'm speaking for those of us who've already sort of taken that step, and continuing that process of taking those assets into community ownership is the radical continuation, if we want to use that word. I appreciate the points mentioned in terms of crofting, in terms of renewables, carbon credits. Yes, it does need updating or reform, or some kind of addressing the issues, of course. But I think what we're really doing is working.
Thanks, Michael. And maybe then to go back to what we were talking about before, it's not just about the feeling that, it's not just about recognising that what each community landowner group is doing is radical in itself within the historical pattern of changing land ownership in Scotland, but it's about communicating the radicalness of that and communicating the benefits and the impacts of that radical land model, and encouraging other communities to step forward and consider what's going to work for them. I'm having a red timeout flag being waved at me, but before we move on to the final part of the evening, I just want to come back to each of the panellists, and Michael, I'm going to go to you first, I'm sorry, but just to say a final few words, if there's anything that's come out of this evening, what you've heard from the other panellists and from the floor that you're going to take away with you and think about for the next 5 years.
Yeah, so I suppose I'd take it back to Simon and the legacy that he's left so many communities throughout, particularly the islands, and that we should value and appreciate and be thankful for what he has given us and for what has been given to us. And not forget that it's a privilege and a very enjoyable and precious thing that we can manage our own land and our own assets freely.
Great. Maria.
I suppose it's a great evening, and I think, although we've been for a long time in our journey, we are still a very new organisation in terms of owning an asset, and it's really useful to hear what Michael and Isla had to say about their own stories. I think for me it's about highlighting how important community ownership is in very different circumstances. The situations we've got with Isla and Michael are so different to what it means to own land in an urban community like Inverness. So it's quite important to be able to sort of share that common understanding and see the value it has in different ways to our communities. So thank you.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think it's really inspiring to hear other trusts. I think when you've been operating for 20 odd years, that you get kind of bogged down in the day-to-day and seeing what goes on within your own community. So hearing like the bigger picture and the history of it all as well is so important, and yeah, just inspiring to hear.
Great, thank you all. Now, we're going to just take a step back from the sort of nitty-gritty practicalities of community ownership and welcome Anne Martin to the stage. So including a musical performance within the Memorial Lectures has always been important, not just because it gives us a sort of an interlude to reflect ourselves personally on what's been discussed, but because music and cultural heritage are such an important part of the story of our land and the land rights movement. And this has been reflected in the ongoing work that Agnes already mentioned, the 100 Years of Community Ownership project that Ian and others are doing within community land ownership. But it's also reflected in the work of the work of musicians and artists who are themselves building those connections between their performances, their songs, their storytelling, and how that relates to land, the land on which they were born, the land on which they may be lost, and also the land which is now being won back again. And I can't think of a person better able to talk about this and to demonstrate this within her own music than Anne, who is an award-winning traditional Gaelic singer, a performer, an actor, a promoter, a tutor, a mentor, an educator, and a recent inductee of the the Scottish Traditional Music Hall of Fame. So, welcome to the stage, Anne, and please, over to you.
I would challenge anybody to ask for any genre or any topic that Gaelic song doesn't cover, because we can talk about everything, and in particular land. Nature. Some things have never changed. You know, land, its use and its ownership has been a continuous theme in Gaelic poetry. I live in the north end of Skye, in a beautiful north end of Skye, and behind my house there is a township called Carloway, which was cleared in 1888. But as far back as 1745 in Carloway, one could only hope about the potential of actually not owning the land, but actually being allowed to use that land. And the people at the time, as I say, this song goes back way before 1745, but they were able to put that into a context of a dance song and just lighten that load, feeling that it was just a frivolous hope. Then further south, towards Butry and in the braes of Throtanish, around there, in Scorrybreak, around 1820, Norman Nicholson wrote about being deprived of his hunting liberties. Now, in the words of Anne Lorne Gillis, thank you, Anne, she refers to Norman's song. To the Gael, the land belonged to God. Man was but his steward, and everyone had the right to share the produce of God's hill and rivers. Now, poor Taranach was encouraged to emigrate, but not by the landowners, but by his own family. His uncle had developed rather urban attitudes as an English-based lawyer, sorry for those of you, and strongly advised that Norman would give up his old ways of poaching which were now perceived to be a crown. Is so often used when talking about land reform. In fact, I was with children last week and there was a great wee debate. They were primary aged kids and they were talking about clearances, and one was asking the other, what were the clearances? And they went, Mary Vaughan Noran solved it all. However, she wasn't on her own. There was all started in Balthus and Skye. And of course there was the Glendale Martyrs, of which Neil MacLeod was one, the Glendale Bard, who in one of his songs says, "The Gaels have declined in their finesse and have yielded to weakness in many matters. The rule of their land and country they have handed to people with no right here." His songs were described as a sort of pop culture of the time, which is maybe why one of his more rousing songs was sung to the very ever-popular tune of Scots Wahey. His message was really, this is our time to take responsibility. I'm not sure we've done that yet. So, about a few years ago, 2022, I was working in Rasley Primary School, and we did a big project about the clearances there, which of course were not once, but people were actually moved twice from that same area. And the kids sat in the Torre, and we wrote this little song together, where they talk about their connection that they felt as they sat in the stones in Fiarn and talked about their great-great-grandparents and what troubles they'd had. I'm very lucky to have a direct line to our present poet on Scotland, our Macha. And I phoned him the other day to say, have you written anything recently about land ownership or anything of that ilk? And he said, continuously, making references to it. But he said, I've just done one recently about our own family. So he's my nephew. And he's written this little piece of poetry. Melancholy. Cha chrechni gan bhíéis mí riamhgúcht, mu mar chair síserin an fuadachach arónai. Gus bethe is scríbig an thrai fat da bhliana. A giasgich, sa giche filchagen, a gal fasgich an an oa. The melancholy, in reference to how we might all feel after having been enforced migration. I don't think I've ever told you before about my family being cleared from Rona. Living for 2 years or thereabouts on the shore, surviving off fishing and winkles, sheltering in caves. For in truth, I know little about it beyond these passed down family rumours. The slippery facts of them living in Dry Harbour and then, at the next census, somewhere else. Not every shame persists, though enough do. Those memories of departure and schism, of poverty lived through, of torpedoes, of the houses and lands and gods wrangled over between siblings. I think we should all just take a wee time at this point to think not just about our own land use, but those across the globe who face even more brutal evictions from their lands. But we also talk about the beauty of the land. And in this song, there is a magical fairy who might take you away and to a place of bountiful salmon and rivers, deer on the land, on the hill, and a life of happiness.
Hey, MacInnes Field, St. John, good Lord, looks a fine. Sigalakrin, you chill the kill, St. Shailan, Nuri, shine. Geoffrey, me all that good, followed, go Some of the growth it was begin, nach glory should put him, Nach boi'r fflat o bryn y Cynniac, bydd na Cynniac yn gadwain. Cwtiach y gael oren, sgach gwyd oer tog y ffyn. Och yn barag yseianol, y geioch Na fin na fian na benaran, yn cael sio i
Thank you, Anne. That was just fantastic and incredibly moving. If anyone wants to see Anne do more of this stuff, she is taking her One Lady show and tune to the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, so make sure you have a look out for that. I'm really glad, Anne, that you brought in that international connection, because one thing I wanted to do at the end of this session was to return back to something that Agnes talked about at the inaugural Simon Fraser Memorial Lecture, which was in Edinburgh in January 2024, and is on the CLS YouTube channel, but I would really encourage you to have a look at it because it's an incredibly moving whole evening of talking and music and thinking and celebrating. You talked, Agnes, at that event about the fact that you had been reading the book Songlines at the time, which is a book about a conversation with Indigenous communities across Australia, and they are describing how they use songs not just as a way of connecting to their land, but as a way of mapping their travel, their important places, their memories, and the past and the future of where they're going across, how they navigate their landscape through song. And one of the things they said in the book was that when you look behind you, you see the future in your footsteps. And I think this is just such a fantastic encapsulation of, the importance for the community land movement of building on what's come before, both in terms of recognising and confronting the historical injustices that we face in Scotland, but also in terms of being able to reconnect ourselves personally now with the land that we are currently on, our place, our community, in order to work together and become a better version of the land and the community in which we manage together. Now, the question of what radical change we need in order to do that more is one I think we should take to the pub after this. But I just think this really, for me, brings everything together in terms of what the Simon Memorial Lectures are all about. And it's been fantastic to hear from Maria and Isla and Michael about their own communities and what they are doing. So thank you very much for your contributions. But I'm afraid now I'm going to have to bring everything to a close. So I have a few thank yous also to give. So thank you firstly to Anderson MacArthur and Harper MacLeod for sponsoring this evening's event. Thank you to the venue staff for their assistance, to the staff of CLS, particularly Meg, who's done such an amazing job of organising everything this evening, to our speakers and our contributors, Maria, Isla, Michael, and Martin, and Fraser, Maggie, John and Agnes, and a special thanks to John Watt, who tomorrow is stepping down from the board of Community Land Scotland, and he's leaving us a big hole, but a very important legacy in terms of what he's contributed to the organisation over the years. And thank you finally to everyone who's joined us this evening. We're going to be heading to the Black Isle Bar to continue this conversation, so please come with us, and otherwise I hope you all have a safe journey home. Thank you.